All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to begin. Good afternoon. I'm Alex Pollock of AEI, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to our conference on our Americans prepared for retirement. Have we got a retirement crisis, or have we just got a series of retirement finance problems? In any case, we can say that we have a historically novel situation. That is, people expecting to live in later life, say from age 63 to 83 or 93, 20 or 30 years with comfortable incomes, but without working. That's new. And under what circumstances is such an idea even possible to happen? We might contrast, in this context, the first state old age pension plan, that of the German Empire, under the famous Chancellor Bismarck in 1889, and ask ourselves, what was the retirement age in Bismarck's retirement plan in 1889? Well, it was 70 years old. I don't know what life expectancy was in Germany in 1889. I tried to find out once and didn't succeed. But you can bet it was a lot less than 70 years old. So Bismarck's plan was insurance against the relatively small risk of living too long, financially speaking. This is an utterly different problem from our problem, which is a savings problem in the first place, against the very high probability of a much longer life, well into your 80s. And of course, we also have the same insurance problem of the financial risk of living too long. But we can say that the 70 years old of Bismarck's age for this insurance part of the problem, if you agree with me that you have to think of it as a savings problem and an insurance problem, the insurance part of it would have equivalent to Bismarck 70 years old today, let's say 80 or 85 years old, when that equivalent plan would kick in. Now, in his book, Charlie says, facing this savings problem, you can either save more or work longer, or you can do both, of course. And obviously, it's a trade-off. If you don't want to work longer, you can save a lot more. If you don't want to save more, you can work a lot longer. Now, I sum this up in what I call the W to R ratio, W being the years that you will work, and the R, the years you expect to be retired and have income without working. So the key is, how many years are you going to work compared to how many you want to have income without working? And there are numbers behind this, but for the moment, just let me assert that you have to get the W to R ratio up to at least 3 or 4, preferably higher, to have a financeable proposition. That is to say, you have to be working 3 or 4 times as many years as you expect to sit around comfortably or taking tours or whatever you're going to do, without and having income without working to be financeable. For example, let's say you were going to start work at 22 and live to 82, and that would be not unusual these days. So that's 60 years. How are you going to divide those years up between work and retirement? Well, if you retire at 70, a proposal of Charlie's, your W to R ratio would be 4. And at 4, the financeability is possible. If you retired at 67, which happens to be the average retirement age in the United States in 1950, 67, your work to retirement ratio would be 3, and it's still doable, but you'd have to have a very high savings rate. And if you thought you were going to retire at 62, which means you would have worked only 2 years for every year that you think you're going to have income, you have essentially an impossible problem. You cannot figure out how to finance such a structure. So with that, by way of introductory thoughts, have we got a crisis, or have we just got a series of hard problems? And in either case, what is to be done? And you are about to hear. Our first speaker will be Charlie Ellis, the co-author of Falling Short, The Coming Retirement Crisis and What to Do About It. Here it is. We hope, and Charlie would appreciate it if you would buy a copy.
Turn it so everybody can see how short it is.
It's very short. Looks like about a, maybe one long airplane ride book, which is a good length. Charlie was managing partner of Greenwich Associates, an international strategy consulting firm, for 3 decades. I can remember your telling us, Charlie, just what our customers thought about us in old days in banking, in those Greenwich days. Charlie's taught at the business schools of both Harvard and Yale, has served on the governing boards of Yale, the Harvard Business School, Exeter, the Stern School of Business, and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and currently chairs the Whitehead Institute for Biomedical Research. With this research, you're helping make the retirement problem worse by extending lives, I assume. He's the author of 16 books and has been honored for lifetime contributions to the investment profession. Then we'll hear from Andrew Biggs, a resident scholar and colleague at AEI. Andrew studies Social Security reform, state and local government pensions, and public sector pay and benefits. Before joining AEI, he was the Principal Deputy Commissioner of the Social Security Administration for Policy Research. In 2005, as an Associate Director of the White House National Economic Council, he worked on Social Security reform. He's still working on Social Security reform. I'm sure he'll talk about it today. And one day, you will succeed, Andrew, I'm sure.
Or retire.
But
I won't say which will come first.
Let's go for success.
Andrew has also served on a blue ribbon panel to understand the huge financial issue of public sector pensions. He's published widely in academic journals, as well as in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post. We're lucky to have presentations from 2 such outstanding students of the status and issues of retirement finance. Each will speak for about 15 minutes, after which we'll give them a chance to react to each other's ideas and clarify or explain points. After that, we'll open the floor to your questions, and we will adjourn promptly at 1:30. Charlie, welcome to AEI, and you have the floor.
Delighted to be here. You should all know that we had a wonderful time at breakfast this morning where I learned 2 things. One is that Andrew's a delightful, very well-informed, and quite objectively rational observer. And the second is that he has taken direct responsibility for much more difficult problems than the one we're talking about today. One is how about the public sector, another is how about the unions, and there's massive problems for retirement. And I think all of us would hope that the principal result of today was that more and more people, thanks to you, would get interested in paying some attention to what is developing rather rapidly into a serious problem in the private sector. The shift from defined benefit to defined contribution or 401k plans is done. It hasn't been completed yet, but there's no way that it's not going to continue towards its real completion. That's a major change. Anytime you have a complex system that has been stable and you change that system, you have to watch out for the possibility of consequences that were unintended, unexpected, and may even be really quite serious. And we've got serious changes. So the most important thing to keep in mind is we've changed the fundamental proposition of a stabilized system in retirement security. The second thing, without anybody's actually doing all that much about it individually, is we have changed longevity enormously. The answer to your implicit question about what was expected life expectancy in Germany in 1890s, nobody knows because the data wasn't being collected. But we do know it was comfortably under 50 years of age, probably 46, maybe 47. So big changes have taken place in how long we live, and the fact that we've got 86 as a reasonable life expectancy today does not mean that that won't increase for people who are living today, because the data hasn't been collected, isn't in yet. But that is a huge change. And we bring people out of an environment where their parents and all the people they've ever talked to or read about had the old defined benefit system, and they knew it was taken care of, and there's an implicit assumption for many people it must be still taken care of. We've shifted the responsibility for virtually every decision away from the corporation that would sensibly have pretty smart, sophisticated staff, could afford expert advisors, had people who spent full time on that question. We've shifted that over to individuals. And before we get to the large number of people who've never, ever done any investing and are now responsible for 401k plans of their own, it's worth keeping in mind that, as Terry O'Dean at the UC Santa Barbara has proven in all of his research, individual investors do not do a good job of investing, nor on saving. And as you go down the economic spectrum, it gets worse and worse and worse. And if you haven't read any of Jack Bogle's wonderful stuff on this subject, go right ahead and read it, because it's systemic and it's really virulent. It's all over the place. Now, we have a couple of other things that are worth keeping in mind. 401ks are a version of the old thrift plans that were set up largely in the Standard Oil of New Jersey complex of companies, because John D. Rockefeller believed thrift was a good thing. As a Baptist, it was important to him. And he wanted his people to practice thrift. So he made a deal that made it very, very attractive for somebody to, in addition to a pension fund, be saving on their own account. And many of those characteristics have stayed with the plans as they've changed over time to 401k plans, but they've never been re-examined. The second thing is that a lot of the regulatory difficulty came because the SEC and the Department of Labor have two completely different concepts of what regulatory priorities are. And lawyers looking at those regulations say, I can't promise you that the government won't say someday down the line, or a court say someday down the line, we've changed the rules and we've changed the understanding. So my advice to you, don't give anybody any advice if you can possibly help it. And as a result, we had millions of people who were relatively underqualified for doing the work they're doing to come into this enormously complicated issue. I have a quick quiz for you, and the good news is you've already gotten part of the answer. So when was 65 or 70 set as the right age for retirement? The answer is 1890s. Next question is, if you took the ratio of working years to retirement years, which you're pretty close to giving away that one too, not quite, if they were the same today as when Social Security was established in 1935, what would be the retirement age today? The next question is, what is the difference in your Social Security benefits if you claim at 62 or you defer claiming until 70 and claim at that age? And the next question is, how many of us will require what we euphemistically call assisted living within our lifetimes? And then the last question is really open-ended. How many American workers know how to plan and save and invest for their retirement reasonably well? And the answer to the first question, we've already heard. 70, 65. There's some doubt back and forth on that. If we keep the same ratio of working years to retirement years, retirement today would be 70. Maybe a little bit higher, but 70. If you wait to claim Social Security benefits until you're 70, instead of claiming at 62, what is the rate of increase? When I ask my quote-unquote smart friends in Wall Street what they think it would be, they say, oh, Charlie, it's got to be a big number. Certainly more than 20%. I'm guessing 25, maybe even 30%. Well, the actual answer is easy to remember in this country. It's 76% increase, and it's inflation protected, and it goes on as long as you live. So the two big risks that nobody ever talks about, inflation risk and longevity risk, are vaporized. About half the people who are 65, half the couples, will have one or the other of them in assisted living for at least 6 months during their lifetimes. Almost nobody plans on the expense of assisted living, but that's a quarter of our population will, in fact, be, on the present kind of demographics, getting assisted living. As the demographics get updated because we're living longer and longer and longer, it's probably going to rise. 25% is large. And the last question on how many people do a good job of thinking about saving and investing and planning for retirement, the answer has to be few, maybe very few. And it's really disconcerting when you think who is being put in control of the future of those individuals and their families. Let me try to pick up on a couple of things that really matter. 401k experience, which we haven't had a lot of, but we've had enough of to know what's going on, show a series of opportunities for the companies sponsoring those 401k plans to substantially improve their work. A lot of it comes out of the work in behavioral economics led by Richard Thaler at the University of Chicago. It's a very easy proposition. Keep freedom of choice for the individual. Do not keep freedom of design to the company. After all, the US nation puts $162 billion into tax benefit incentives to get people to do the right thing in retirement. Keep individual freedom sacrosanct, but do have mandatory characteristics of the plan. Easy solution to that is, on each of the important decisions, each individual is free to opt out of a blue plate special. Don't have to opt in. The difference today, you have to opt in. So if you want to be in the plan, you have to say, I want to be in the plan. Opt out, you could say, I don't want to be in the plan. Fine, your choice. Protect freedom of choice, but set the design up correctly. And if you go through the different factors, participation becomes automatic. Participation automatically escalates over time. Each time you get a raise, a small fraction of that goes into increasing your savings rate, probably pretty easy to live with. You match the match at the very beginning and then build up from there. The employer and the employee both understand what the Social Security benefits are. That 76% is a bell ringer for most people who've never, ever thought it was anything like that. Make sure that's really well understood. When an employee leaves the company, make it easy for them to stay in the company. Otherwise, they're likely to be an endangered species going out into the world, surrounded by people who say they work for financial service organizations, but candidly are dreadful in the way in which they behave. Might want to consider adding an ALDA towards the end of life plan, because many people don't know how long they're going to live, and the worst fear in the world is to outlive your resources. Easy to do. And finally, each individual should be given at least a template by which they could guide themselves on how much to take from their plan for spending. You can do required minimum distribution, be fine, or you can use the 4% adjusted for inflation. Either one of those is fine, and offering both of them simultaneously would make an awful lot of sense. But we haven't come anywhere near facing the problem of people taking money out. Sample of one, terrible thing to do, particularly since I built my career on large sample studies. Sample of one, woman that I cared deeply about, worked for the firm that I worked for. She worked there for 25 years, retired. Wendy, I said, how are you doing on your investment withdrawals? We have been talking once a year. I review her investments and give her some coaching. Oh, Charlie, it's really simple. We take very little. I'm very glad to hear that, but you and David must be taking something. Yes, very, very little. Well, Wendy, how much are you and David taking out each year? Charlie, it's so small. It's only 10%. And you can figure out the rest of it. If you stay at work until you're 70 and continue to be in a 401k plan, there are 3 different ways that you can accumulate that plan in a way that works even better than the 76% increase. First, you're not taking money out. Secondly, those are the sort of saucer years when you actually can afford to do more saving, and it'll be on your agenda or your spouse's agenda, and you will know that saving is a darn good idea. And third, you get a rate of return on those investment assets. Uncertain, I will grant you. But if you take a very sobering kind of rate of return expectation, those 3 things together, don't take money out, do put money in, and have an accumulation over time. That was almost guaranteed to add more than 100% to how much you can take out of your 401k plan. And the two together, Social Security and your 401k plan, lift a lot of boats up to the level where they can be okay in their retirement period. If they don't do those things, they're going to have a very tough time saving enough to come around the corner. And I think all of us have a responsibility to do what we can to help people understand the question, understand the power of free choice, and give some coaching in terms of directions they might want to consider instead of leaving them to their own. Because if we leave them to their own, we already know from behavioral economics and from the history of individual investors, it's not going to be a nice thing. So that's my hope. And I see no reason for us not to say, you know, when we were children, we used to read The Little Dutch Boy Who Put His Finger in the Dike. And if we were to take action soon, this is not a difficult problem to deal with. And it's certainly no crisis. But if we sit around and suck thumbs for 15 or 20 or 25 years, it's going to be a vicious crisis. And we will see people are back where they were in the 1950s, old, broke, and on their own. I don't want to go there, and I don't think our country does. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlie. Andrew.
Well, thank you very much for coming today. Thank you, Charlie, for the kind words, and Alex for your very kind introduction. I feel a bit of a disadvantage. Charlie's told me of a difficult problem. Alex has told me of a mathematically unsolvable problem. And yet, I'm an optimist. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about my thinking on retirement security and preparation, and I hope give some alternate points of view. I'm not here to argue that everything is hunky-dory and we have no problems whatsoever, but I do think the idea that we face a retirement crisis that demands dramatic action, I think that's overstated and really has some downsides to it. I mean, it is common, if you Google the phrase retirement crisis, you will find a lot of articles and studies claiming that, you know, majorities, often vast majorities of Americans are undersaving for retirement, that we have a retirement savings gap of trillions of dollars. In some sense, though, for the average person, though, I mean, saying that Americans are undersaving for retirement is kind of an innocuous statement. It's almost like saying we need to appreciate our mothers more. It's just something that people say. The problem is there's no downside to appreciating your mother more. There is a downside to thinking we face a crisis that we may not actually face. Because when policymakers make decisions and actions during what they perceive to be a crisis, often the outcome is not very good. What I want to start is first running through a couple of factoids that I often hear that people take on board, they base proposals on them, and they may or may not be the case. For instance, I mean, it's common to hear that Americans are over-reliant on Social Security, increasingly reliant on Social Security, that they're not getting much income from IRAs and 401ks. The Social Security Administration, where I used to work, puts out statistics that basically support this point of view. Last year, we were here having an event where someone who had sort of digested these statistics then produced a proposal saying, well, because 401ks aren't working and people are too reliant on Social Security, we need to expand Social Security pretty significantly. We need to pay for it by eliminating the tax subsidies to 401ks because they're clearly not working. The problem with those statistics is that the SSA gets their data from the census, and the census survey that counts this income from IRAs and 401ks doesn't count most of it as income. That if you get a regular monthly income, like from Social Security, defined benefit, pension, that they count as income. If you just withdraw from your IRA or 401k as needed, that's not counted as income. So you have folks drawing conclusions about the success or failure of the IRA and 401k system based on data that excludes most of the income people are deriving from these plans. This was an issue, policy folks at Social Security have raised this for quite some time. Just in the past year or so, the Census Bureau has tried to improve the current population survey, improve the questions in there to get a better reading of the amount of money people are getting from these retirement plans. And I think they have improved it. You can do their side-by-side comparisons. Still, though, I think they're falling short. If you go to, I think these data are 2013, The updated, improved census data shows that retirees received about $324 billion in income from pensions and annuities. And that's more than the old CPS questions would have given you. But IRS data show that households over age 65 received about $590 billion in taxable pension and annuity income. So even the improved census data may be missing over $260 billion in retirement income. Now, that doesn't mean everything's hunky-dory. And it doesn't mean if you've got low-income folks who don't have an IRA or 401k, it doesn't do anything for them. But remember, the retirement crisis narrative is that not just that a few isolated low-income people are undersaving, it's that vast majorities of Americans are undersaving by large amounts. If you're not counting all the income they're getting, then that's going to leave you a misperception of the size of the problem. Similarly, some people cite data from the Survey of Consumer Finance, which comes out of the Fed. And these data are calculated to show the ratio of wealth to income for a household. And these ratios of wealth to income have been declining in recent years. And people point to these declines, and they say that chart alone, that data alone, shows we have a retirement crisis. When you actually pull through the data, though, you find most of the decline in this ratio of wealth to income among households is due to the housing crisis. Once the housing bubble popped, then the housing wealth households held declined, and so their total wealth to income ratio declined. When you look at retirement savings, though, that's held up pretty well. So essentially, and even if they've lost housing wealth, I mean, housing is both an asset for a household, but it's also a cost for a household. When those things go together, you're at least partially hedged. So the idea that this one statistic is showing you have a retirement crisis, I think, really isn't correct. If you look at aggregate retirement saving, if we combine the Federal Reserve and what used to be called the flow of funds has data on the amounts people have saved in things like IRAs and 401ks, and the benefits they're owed through defined benefit plans, corporate DB plans, state and local plans. Take that amount and combine it with Social Security Administration data on the amount of Social Security benefits that people have accrued, the amount they've earned but have not yet been paid out to them. 1996 is the earliest date for which you can get all of those figures. But in 1996, this kind of total retirement saving amount was equal to about 269% of personal incomes. In 2013, that total was 391% of personal incomes. It's a pretty substantial increase. Again, this doesn't show everyone is saving adequately, but I think it again points the idea that the average person is facing a crisis, that we have this big decline in retirement saving. I don't really think that's the case. So in addition to those two factors, there's a couple of ways that I think about this problem that I think lead to a little more, I don't want to say I'm sanguine about it, but it makes me a little more confident in where we stand. To look at the first one, there's a number of studies that find that large numbers or majorities of Americans are at risk of an inadequate income in retirement. To judge that, you have to say, well, how much will people have, but also how much do they want to have? How much do they need to have in retirement in order to have an adequate income? So you're setting a target for them and seeing whether they meet the target or not. These studies, or the most prominent one, assumes that Americans want their incomes, the way I put it is keeping up with the Joneses. They want a retirement income that rises with the wages of other workers in the economy, of other ages in the economy. They want their standard of living to rise over time with that of other Americans. And that's one way of thinking about it, but I tend to think that's kind of a minority point of view among people who think about these things. The standard way of thinking about it is what you want to do is you think of the total assets and income you have over your own lifetime, and you want to smooth that level. So you don't want to have more in one year and less in another. You want to have essentially a smooth level of income. So that's another way of setting a target, and I think one that's probably more consistent with how people generally think about this stuff. This keeping up with the Joneses approach sets a target for retirement income that's around 20% higher than if you simply assumed people wanted to have the same inflation-adjusted average income from year to year between work and retirement. So if you set the target 20% higher, that's going to mean more people are going to fall short of it, and it's going to make it seem as if we're closer to a retirement crisis. A second way that this plays out is in thinking about the role of children and retirement saving. And the recent studies show that a household with 2 kids has about 10% less wealth than a similar household without any kids. So what you find is the households with kids will end up retiring with less wealth, lower incomes than those who don't have kids. If you're setting the same retirement income target for the two households, you assume that these households with kids and childless households demand the exact same income in retirement. Households with kids are more likely to fall short. But there's a good reason why households with kids would save less. I mean, I have a 6-year-old. I mean, the joke is that this is from Jonathan Skinner, who's an economist up at Dartmouth, but the joke is parents get used to eating peanut butter during their working years because all their money is going to the kid. And so if they want to maintain that same standard of living in retirement, it doesn't cost as much to buy peanut butter in retirement versus the childless household, which is having fine wine and caviar and all that. And I don't think I had fine wine and caviar, but I will say that going from when my wife was working, we had no kids, our material standard of living was substantially higher than it is now that we have a kindergarten with whom I have a peanut butter and jelly sandwich every day. There's a lot of studies adjust for this. You know, if you assume that the children are consuming part of the household's income during their working years, and you assume the parent wants to maintain his own standard living from work into retirement, that means they don't have to save quite as much in order to maintain that standard of living. I did a study on this a few years ago, and those sorts of adjustments have a really substantial effect. Just to illustrate how big an effect that is, the National Retirement Risk Index done by Boston College, they don't do this kind of adjustment for household size, and they find that around 52% of Americans are undersaving for retirement. They have calculated if they did this kind of adjustment, that percentage would fall to 17%. So it's a massive effect. Now, there's sort of this ongoing debate about how households react with their saving rates when kids leave home and all that. And I think there's something to that. But there's one easy way to test, I think, whether parents, households who had kids are less secure in retirement than those without. And that's just to ask them. The Health and Retirement Study asks retirees subjective questions. You know, how does your retirement standard of living compare to before retirement? Do you worry about your retirement income? If households with kids were systematically undersaving, if they were more likely to be at risk of inadequate income retirement, you would expect they would tell the HRS, I worry more about retirement income. My retirement is not as good as before my my pre-retirement years. There's no difference there. So maybe we should argue parents should aim for a higher standard of living. Maybe we should argue they should feel unhappy in retirement, but the evidence indicates they don't. So I think if you include these adjustments for presence of children and household size, again, the share of households who look like they're undersaving for retirement drops a ton. So if you did these two things, adjusting so that people want to have a steady standard of living from work into retirement and adjusting for the presence of kids, it really has a massive, very large effect on your perceptions of how well Americans are going to be in retirement. And I guess to close up, what I say to you is, I mean, if there is a retirement crisis, it's not where you think it is. The perception of the retirement crisis, and I'm not discounting anything Charlie says. I mean, individuals are often bad decision makers. They don't sign up for their pension. They invest poorly and all that. But I think the bigger problem really is on the government side. If you look at 401ks, what I think is really encouraging is that all the problems Charlie pointed out and the potential solutions, most of those are being implemented today. Most 401k plans today use automatic enrollment, which has a really dramatic effect on getting people to actually participate. Nearly half of, at least of large plans today, offer automatic escalation. So you start them out at a low saving rate, which they're willing to accept, and you gradually work them up. Most are now using target date funds, which automatically change your asset allocation and helps people who don't know how to handle that. The increased use of index funds by 401ks has dropped the administrative costs by 30 basis points just in the last several years. The new Treasury regulations make it easier to offer annuities in 401ks, which convert your lump sum to a steady monthly income over your retirement. So what we have, I mean, the problems with private plans, 401ks, are design problems. And the encouraging thing to me is we have this research that comes from the behavioral economics field, and that research is actually being implemented. We are fixing this problem. Now look to the government side. Social Security, sort of the modern push for Social Security reform started in the late 1980s with Senator Pat Moynihan. So we've known for basically almost 3 decades that we needed to reform Social Security, and since then we've done precisely nothing. Back in 2005, when I worked at the Bush White House on Social Security reform, he was pushing it. And one of the responses you got, this is, I know specifically from the Senate Democratic leadership, they pointed to the numbers that the Congressional Budget Office came out with for this long-term Social Security deficit. And they said, well, look, the CBO is the official scorekeeper for Congress. They're not showing a very large deficit, at least not large to their minds, so why is this a priority? Since that time, the long-term Social Security deficit, as scored by the CBO, has quadrupled. So you have a much, much larger problem today with Social Security than you did just 5 or 6 years ago. And still, you'd think, okay, if the long-term deficit quadrupled, now we've really got to spring into action. The response from those very same folks, in large part, has been to propose expanding Social Security, but not paying for it. So the amount of unpaid for benefits with Social Security has nearly quadrupled, and the proposal is to let's promise more but not pay yet for what we've already promised. And Alex mentioned I do a lot of work on state and local pensions as well, and it's really the same story there. Back in the good old days, the 1990s, they expanded benefits, they increased the benefits that people were getting, then they found they couldn't pay for them. They're taking increasing amounts of investment risk. Even today, 4 years past the end of the recession, almost 60% of plan sponsors in the state and local pension universe are not making their full annual contribution. And the full annual contribution for a state and local pension is about half as high as a corporate pension would have to pay, assuming the same level of benefits. They have very, very lax accounting standards in the state and local pension world. So they've set themselves a very low bar, and they're failing to meet it. So the question to me is, do you want Americans to become more reliant on a sector of the retirement world, which I think really has not shown a good record of managing itself? Doing that, I think, is putting too many eggs in a very risky basket. If you follow this route of people say, let's expand Social Security and then let's set up the state-run retirement plans, the secure choice, that kind of stuff. What you're going to end up with is a lot of people getting essentially all their retirement income from the government. And philosophically, full disclosure, that's not something I'm too happy with. But just as a basic diversification kind of management, and I'm not sure, even if Charlie had shown himself to be a person who's a very, very poor manager of money, I wouldn't give my money to him to handle for retirement. Similarly, the track record on Social Security and state and local pensions is really poor. So what I would like to see is that Social Security be reformed to be financially sustainable. So it's a benefit you can rely on that we know can actually be paid in the future. That we're not forcing future taxpayers to pay taxes we wouldn't be willing to pay ourselves. But second, we want to make it a much better safety net for low-income people. This is a subject for another day, but I'll just say we have about nearly 1 in 10 retirees living in poverty today. You could give every retiree a poverty-level benefit for about half of the $900 billion we currently spend on Social Security. The upshot, those middle and upper income people are going to have to save more on their own. And that's fine by me, because those same people, if you go back to the 1950s or 1900s, those are the same people, they saved quite a bit more than middle and upper income people save today. So they could, they should, and I think they would save more if they really had to. What public policy has to do is assist in making that possible, such as making automatic enrollment for 401ks universal, so that everybody's automatically enrolling people. Lowering regulatory burdens so that small employers are more likely to offer retirement plans. Somewhere around 3/4 of employers today offer retirement plans, but it's within the small employers where that's a problem. And they have fixed costs of regulatory costs and setting up the plan. Things like multiple employer defined contribution plans, I think, could expand opportunities to save and really make this sort of a priority for us. So I think even if we don't face a retirement crisis, we do face some significant challenges. I think the key is to identify what those real challenges are and find practical ways to address them. Making people more reliant on retirement plans that have not been well managed and less reliant on the plans that we're actually seeing improvement in, it doesn't strike me as the best route forward. I will end with that. Thank you very much to you both.
Thanks, Andrew. I want to give Charlie and Andrew a chance to expand on any comments or react to what the other one said, say 2 minutes or so. Charlie?
I'll be brief. Uh, Some of what we've got as a problem is the communications. We're used to the language, full retirement age, capital, 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 being 65. If we stopped talking that way and shifted the conversation over to 70, we'd make a major positive change. And I think that sort of change, very low cost, very high reward, is something we ought to be able to do. If the average person arriving at 65 has in their 401k plan an amount that they would describe in words as more dough than I ever dreamed I would have in my own name, let me tell you, it's big. Give me the number, Wendy. Really big. It's over $100,000. It's 110,000 smackers. And for those of us who've been around the world of finance a little bit, that is a very unfortunate combination. Plenty, or more than enough, or more than I ever thought I'd have, and then the number that just doesn't square up with that. We need to help people learn much more about, understand much better what the problems really are. And I think it's delightful that you and I are in so accord with a lot of different things. We might differ on, I believe it should be made mandatory across anybody who has got a qualified plan instead of voluntary. Yes, we've increased the number who are offering plans. We've increased the number of people who are participating in plans. We've increased the number of people who are doing the escalating of their contributions. Those are all really important increases, but what's left over is also a really significant number, and we ought to get past it's voluntary, but it's not working, it's voluntary, and it is working, and say, look, if you want to be part of the US system, play fair, here are the rules. Nobody has argued these rules aren't completely fair. Nobody says, I don't like best practices and I don't want to have anything to do with it. So I think we ought to be prepared to go in that very important direction. And then I keep coming back to Harry Truman's wonderful definition of the difference between a recession and a depression. A depression is when you're out of a job, and a recession is when your neighbor is out of a job. And many of us who are in this room or in our crowd or in a variety of other ways, part of the total package, have a tough time recognizing how powerful it is to have income, median income for someone who is 65, roughly $68,000, $69,000, to drop that down by much, and where are you going to make the savings, is a very different question than if you ask me, could I cut back on my expenses? Because I've got much more flexibility than somebody's at that level. I think we ought to be thinking about the impact, not just on could you get by, but would you be reasonably comfortable? And I recognize it's really different when I'm talking about my being reasonably comfortable, and I'm talking about your being reasonably comfortable. I'm going to be alert to that difference. But I'm thrilled that most of the things you and I talked about in the private sector, I think we would agree on, minor adjustments here and there. And then I'm really glad that you're worrying about the public sector and the others, which are more severely difficult.
Thanks. Andrew?
I really don't have a big philosophical problem with making participation in a pension plan mandatory. I think you might have, given the Supreme Court ruling on the individual mandate for the Affordable Care Act, there may be some legal issues there. I guess the practical question is, how close to the goal does automatic enrollment get you versus truly universal mandatory participation? And I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I think automatic enrollment gets you about 80% of people. So you're having 20%.
And there is one minor adjustment. I think your numbers or perception was based on people who are newly employed. Are they getting enrolled automatically?
Yeah.
There might be a difference for people who have been employed and haven't been automatically enrolled. Should they be now automatically enrolled?
Yeah, and I think there's a public policy reason for the opt-out. If it truly becomes universal and mandatory, then I think there is a temptation for government to micromanage everything and saying, okay, well, you're required to do this. Now we're going to say here's what you can and can't invest in, towards social goals, things like that. If the person has the opt-out to say, you've pushed it too far, that might keep the pressure from from getting too bad on that. It's something I could probably go either way on, but I think we agree that it's just getting these opportunities, getting people signed up. I mean, if everybody saved the way they need to save, the burden on Social Security would be a lot smaller. I don't mean in some programmatic sense, but I mean, it just, it's Social Security, I mean, it provides a base of income, often not particularly securely, but for people who are so poor they couldn't really save on their own, for people who wouldn't save regardless. But it also does substitute for a lot of saving that middle and upper income people would do on their own. And so I think we want to shift that balance a little bit more, have a better safety net on the bottom end, but at some point we've got to level with people and say, look, you've got a good income, you got to start saving, dude. And it's, sometimes we don't want to do that, but I think at the end of the day, I mean, Medicare is an even bigger problem that we have to face. And so I think targeting the programs a little bit more tightly, I think, makes sense.
And one general observation on financial systems that comes out of this discussion is we know as a rule an asset that all governments want you to invest in. That's government debt. All governments like that, and Social Security's investment theory, to the extent they have assets, is invest in government debt. One of the problems. I wanted to Charlie, to ask you a question. In your book, you mentioned something which didn't come up in your remarks, and that's the role of the house in retirement savings. In an old-fashioned way, if you paid off the house, it became a form of forced savings, in fact, or at least a regular savings. You want to say another word about what you discuss in the book about the role of the house?
Well, I think it's basically the simplest answer is it ought to be included in the thinking of those who have houses. And of course, the group that we would say they've really got problems are farther down the spectrum, and many of them don't have houses. But those who do want to be realistic, that that's part of their total capability. We also know that as the years have gone by, more and more people have seen their children going to more and more school. More and more people go to college, more and more of those go to graduate school, and the cost of that does mount up. And therefore, people are deferring when they're going to save for themselves. And so there's going to be some interesting trade-offs back and forth. I think all three of us, and I'm sure everybody else in the room would agree, one of the most wonderful things we could do is gather more rigorous and systematic information, because we're dealing with, 320 million people, and many of them are different from other people, and the complexities are really fantastic. And trying to work in aggregates and make philosophical judgments that really make sense is not easy. And more information will be tremendously helpful. One thing that might be helpful to those of you who are thinking about the 401k group, I made mention of John D. Rockefeller and his Baptist background and his wanting to get people to do thrift. You may remember that his children had to fill out, and his grandchildren had to fill out weekly budgets to teach them thrift, and the budget had to include setting aside a certain amount of savings. And these are kids that are going to be dreams of affluence right down the road. He cared deeply. When he was running the Standard Oil Company, he believed he wanted to get people to participate in the great characteristic strengths of the American way. And the best way to do that is to be a shareholder. So he offered, if you will put up some money, I will match it, and we'll invest it in the best company in the history of the world, Standard Oil. And then when they broke up into parts, the plans broke up with them, so that it continued on. Because people were being asked to volunteer incremental over their pension fund, Mr. Rockefeller thought it was really important that they not feel it was going to be a trap, and that he ought to be able to get the money back anytime they needed it. So he wrote that into the plan to make it more attractive for the people that might think, I'd like to do it, but I'd like to get the match, but I can't afford to have this money tied up forever. I might need it. My kids might have a problem. I might have a problem. So many of the characteristics of 401k plans today have just migrated from Mr. Rockefeller's plan way, way, way back when. And if we were to anywhere near start from scratch, we would not have those characteristics. That's a real problem.
Interesting. Andrew, any final comments before we move to questions?
No, I'll leave time for questions.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to move to your questions. And let me remind you how this works. We have microphones. We're going to hold up your microphones here. When you're called on, please wait for the microphone, because this is all public record and you're going to be for posterity on the AEI website. And then tell us your name and your affiliation, and ask your question, just in case somebody might be tempted to preface the question with too long a set of remarks. The chair will remind you to come to your question. So floor is open for your questions. The first one back here.
Okay, my name is Bonnie Wachtel, and I am in this industry. So I'll start with a very short comment, which backs up what the chair had said, which is, I'll address this to Andrew. And that is just, while you were talking, I was also thinking about reverse mortgages, maybe not perfect, but a new item. And it seems to me if you're adding up the available assets in the total pool, you would certainly want to add that in. However, that's not my question. Look, if you're dreaming about new laws, that you could have a law passed, which would you prefer? Which would be more important? A law with some potentially forced savings for individuals in private plans, or your best cleanup idea for these absolutely terrifying state and local plans that to some extent are really, it's like a dagger at the throat of the municipal bond market now, and potentially the stock market as well?
Okay, Andrew.
That's a little bit of a tough question, just because they're hitting different universes of people. I think about improving saving opportunities. You're talking about the whole population. The state and local plans, a very small number of workers, but very, very large unfunded liabilities. And I think real potential to destabilize state and local finance. If I rephrased your question, if I had a choice between, say, going for mandatory, or let's just say universal saving through 401ks versus, say, my preferred Social Security reform plan, I would take the preferred Social Security reform plan in a minute, because I think 401ks are already heading in a direction that I think is really the right direction. I think it's going to well serve people. With Social Security, you have, leave aside the underfunded element of it, which is a not insignificant thing to leave aside, but it is, particularly at the low end, it's a very unreliable social insurance program. On average, low-income people get substantially higher replacement rates from Social Security than high-income people do. But any given household among low-income people gets widely varying replacement rates. Some do very well from the system, others don't do very well from the system. I've advocated having kind of a universal poverty level benefit that everybody would get. That would take your poverty rate to zero, which among retirees would be kind of a nice thing, would also make a much simpler plan for everybody to plan around. I did a paper a couple of years ago using HRS data. I think, if I'm pulling it out right, somewhere around 2/3 of people who are right on the verge of retirement cannot guess their Social Security benefit within plus or minus 25%. So you've got this defined benefit that we all want, but the benefit form is so complicated, people don't know what they're getting. How do you decide how much to save on your own or when to retire if even on the verge of retirement you don't know what you're going to get from Social Security? There's some of us in this room could explain how the benefit formula works. None of us could, without a spreadsheet, actually figure out what we're going to get. So I think simplifying the benefit formula, making a much better safety net at the low end, I think will give people confidence to be able to accept the challenge, at least your middle or higher income, of saving more on your own. So I think the Social Security reform stuff is probably more important. The 401ks are going in the right direction.
Okay.
They could declare bankruptcy. Oh, except for the states. Sorry.
We'll have other conferences on that one, Bonnie.
Bonnie, one thing you might
go ahead,
ask is, could we find a way to have the state and local data divided up by the population responsible for the big aggregates? Because it's easy to say, oh, gosh, that's a big number. Astronomy's a big number. Long distance, I can't remember those numbers. But when you find out that you and your family owe whatever percentage, it attracts a lot of attention.
It's the second mortgage we didn't tell you about.
Yeah. I live in Connecticut, so I'm more alert to it than others. People who live in Chicago are paying a lot of attention. People in Detroit know all about it. We really, as a community, could do ourselves a lot of good by improving the communication. And I believe we could do a massive improvement by improving the communication rendered to individual people by Social Security. This wonderful, wonderful program, imperfect as it is, when you live through the experience of sitting with a counselor, which you're required to do at a certain age group, and the counselor says, "Really? You sure you want to keep working?" And you realize, oh my gosh, other people getting that coaching and counseling are going to come to a different decision. I chose to work past 70, so that's easy. But we do not do as good a job as we could of making it easy for people to understand, and the communications required are not all that hard if you take the time and effort to do it. And
There was an issue when I was at the agency where someone reasonably prominent went into a Social Security field office with his mother, who was thinking of retiring. Or his mother went in, the mother told him about it. And the mother asked the people in the office, at what age should I retire? And they said, oh, 62. And let's say he came back and reported that. And I think the advice has probably improved, but it's, and I think one of the few things I accomplished at the agency was improving the communications to talk to people about the trade-offs. If you work longer, you're buying not just a higher benefit tomorrow, but you're buying a higher benefit when you're 80 or 90 years old, when you really have very few other options. So I think there is evidence that the way you frame it and the way you communicate it to people can have an effect on their actual behavior.
Okay, another question? I'm going to come up here, then we'll get you back here. Up here, right here, the gentleman in the blue suit here.
Hi, my name is Max. I'm an undergraduate. Question about both of you have been talking about, and actually kind of related to what you were just saying about Social Security, but also private plans, which is this whole financial literacy issue. And to respect the preface rule, I won't go into detail, but I can think of at least one study from David Leibson, who's done a lot of research on this, that basically took a bunch of Harvard employees and looked at how effective financial literacy was in terms of having them allocate some money. And it had essentially no statistically significant effect. I think financial literacy is kind of one of those things, like there's a retirement crisis, that everybody says and everybody hears, and it sounds really good. But how effective do you think it really is? And in terms of implementation, what strategies would you propose?
I'd like to answer that because I was appointed by the SEC to lead the effort towards investment education that came out of the misbehavior of analysts, and $50 million was put up to pursue that particular mission. And I gathered in a group of extraordinarily competent experts, some of whom, like David, were economists who'd studied in the field, some of whom were people in the mutual fund industry who understood individual investors quite well. And this grim, grim reality is that we could not find anything that justified spending any money to educate people about investing. And the reason for that is complicated. First of all, most people don't know anything about investing. It sounds like a rude remark, but actually it's just an accurate statement, a description. The second thing is most of those people honestly don't care to know much about investing because it's not for them something that they see a reason why they should go through all the rigmarole trying to learn it. Third, they know that it's very complicated. And they also know the language is unbelievably complicated. It's PE ratios and yields and mark-to-market and a whole bunch of other terms that they're not used to using. And so they just, candidly, it's really easy to do Scarlett O'Hara's. I'll worry about that tomorrow. And the result is people just can't take the time to do something that might, if they did do it, be tremendously helpful. You can help young people learn the benefit of saving. And there's been some pretty good success at teaching in high schools the benefit of saving. You can increase the number of young people who feel pretty good about the entrepreneurial free market system if you have courses on that subject matter, again, in high school. It works out pretty well. But once somebody's got a career and a family and a child who's under 10 and needs to get to different places and getting up at 4 in the morning to fly across the country to be here, there are a lot of different things that crowd out the possibility of sitting down and learning all about it. And we would be really wise if we just accepted that is a human reality. Some people would want to learn all about it. I'm one of those. I've spent 50 years studying the subject. I still don't think that I know enough. I've taught the courses at 2 great universities. I know I don't know enough. I've written half a dozen books on investing. I know for sure I don't know enough. And when I sit with people who are the really, really, really smart people, my circle of friends tend to be New York-centric and financial world-centric, although they do extend all over the world. There are very, very few people who really do have a profound understanding of investing. And if you don't, you're in trouble if you get out there trying to do something. We'd do much better if we concentrated our effort on helping individuals understand what's in it for you personally. And it's not terribly complicated. But if we were to say, this is your age, this is your reasonable life expectancy, this is your income, and you could read it off a table, here's the kind of income you'll probably want to have if you're trying to replace, and you can argue about 70, 75, 80, 65% replacement. That's not a complicated thing. Pick for yourself. Here's how much you would have to have at a reasonable withdrawal rate. And therefore, this is how much you need to be able to save by the time you choose to retire. That we can lay out. Sad reality is that turns out to be such a large number for so many people who didn't really understand how complicated the issue is. They walk away from it saying, I'll never be able to do that. This is really complicated. I wish I hadn't raised the question. I'm going to go worry about something else instead. So your question is wonderfully right, but there are no good answers to that question. And I think we ought to, as a society, recognize that that's the way it is. I work for the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and we committed that we're going to help Americans stop smoking. What is the more obvious case? Clearly relates to cancer. My mother died at 67 of smoking-related lung cancer. It's a compelling proposition. Over a period of 16 years, 14 different variables were found to be necessary to come together to get people to stop killing themselves. So when you get to something like, gee, retirement's way out there, finance is complicated, astronomical numbers, and a whole bunch of other things, it's very, very hard to get people to come around.
But you do know, save more
Well, I
and
know
work longer than you think.
Yes, absolutely. And if you put it in terms of, Charlie, let me just be sure you understand what we're talking about is you and what's going to happen to you. Yeah. And it's in these fairly simple, if we made the effort to put that together, we'd be halfway down the path.
I had a question back here, then Tom, I'm going to come to you next. Back here.
I'm Chris Farrell with Federal Retirees. For Andrew, you talked about secure choice as being, a government plan. Would you explain that better? I mean, I'm thinking of the Illinois plan that's been launched. Is that something you could speak to?
Yeah, there's been a movement in a number of states around the country to set up retirement plans that are called secure choice plans, and they will be defined contribution supplementary retirement plans. And the idea is to provide a saving option for people who are not offered a 401k or a similar plan at work. And I'm a little mixed on it. I do like the idea of expanding savings options, and so that's important to me. On the other hand, I'm not sure there's some practical downsides, and there's the general distrust. The distrust part, it's not like I don't think a state government can't run a 401k plan, but if you look back at the origins of these secure choice plans, they came from folks who very explicitly wanted the government to provide a guaranteed return for people. We'll give you at least the original proposal was at least a 3% real return guaranteed. And the entire problem with state and local pensions is essentially they offered guaranteed returns for people through the plans. They funded them with risky assets. They didn't price the risk. So they end up with an enormous amount of downside that nobody really understood. When they got underfunded, the reaction is to take more risk to get out of it. So you can see how, I don't say the secure choice plans are not as great a danger as the existing DB plans, but that danger is there. there's also the issue that, say, if you go to Illinois, the secure choice plan is exempted small businesses, smaller employers. That's precisely the group that you need to get plans for. I mean, 85% of larger employers offer plans. See, they don't care about them. It's the small employers, but they're exempt because of the regulatory burdens or whatever. And a third concern I have is at least in Illinois, the default contribution or saving rate was 3% of pay. And they basically said, we can't make it higher than that because of political reasons, which I can understand. But you're going to default a lot of people then at a saving rate which may not be enough for them. And because we know through power of inertia, a lot of people say, well, 3%, that's what I'm going to do. Why would the government recommend something that wasn't right for me? So they'll keep saving 3%, which for a lot of folks won't be enough. And then there's the potential danger. Let's say you set up the secure choice plans and employers start essentially dumping their employees from the 401k into the secure choice plan. Then you've got an issue where the average combined 401k contribution today is somewhere close to 10% of pay. Then you get folks, well, if the employer says we're going to put you in secure choice instead, then you're going from 10% to 3%. So it's something which really sounds good, and I don't want to just poo-poo it. There's something there that appeals to me, but I tend to think that the safer approach is to say, how do we really make it make sense for a small employer, the ones we need to reach? How do we make it make sense for them to offer retirement plans? And that's looking at the sort of the fixed costs, the regulatory burdens of, if you're running a bowling alley with 15 employees, your business is running a bowling alley, not jumping through all the hoops necessary to start a plan. So, I mean, again, I don't want to just talk down on the secure choice plans, but there are some downsides there that I think are worth bearing in mind. They're not just an unmitigated positive, I think.
Okay, thanks. Up here, Tom.
Thank you. Tom Donlan from Barron's Magazine. Andrew, your comments about the circling the drain process of underfunding and then you take greater risks is a process that was also going on in the 60s and 70s in private pensions. Private pension sponsors tended to escape by putting it into DB. I think, Charlie, in a way, I wish you had talked a little bit more about how we got to this problem with DB. Would you agree that the corporate sponsors who changed from DB to DC did so primarily to save money, that then they did so out of the fear that their DB plans would bankrupt them? That's the way I remember it, because I covered some pension bankruptcies, and it was clear that everybody else was watching. How much do you think that corporate America saved by engineering the transition from DB to DC?
Charlie, you want
You
to
have a
take on
choice?
that?
I mean,
Sure. There are a lot of different factors that went into the shift over. Regulation, and regulation increased quite a lot. And candidly, corporations don't love having a lot of government regulation, particularly when the regulation was written by people who know all about the laws but don't necessarily know about corporate finance and pensions and all that sort of stuff. So the regulatory factors are really consequential. The second is it put very powerful control among accountants who have a point of view having to do with accounting that may not fit with the way a corporation is thinking things ought to do. The result is that many corporations experienced surprising, just because of capital markets doing something they hadn't anticipated, surprising need to put substantial amounts of money in, which causes a wobbling in their earnings per share, which they're trying very hard to have as fairly consistent growth in earnings per share. And if you're the chief executive officer and on your last year, the government says you've got to put in money because they put you can see how the reaction would be fairly negative. Another factor is the cost of having 401k as opposed to the cost of having a defined benefit, just in terms of operations. You used to pay the fees for managers. Now the employees individually pay those fees. For some, I'm sure that's been a motivating reason. Remember, 401ks really came in during a wonderful, world's largest, longest bull market. So there's something to be said for, well, it worked for me at the time, and I think that was a major factor coming into the same kind of a proposition. Employees liked it because, hey, look, the market's going up and I know what I want to do and I've been given freedom of choice and I'm going to, yes, I did wind up making mistakes, but at the time I thought it was a really good idea. It seemed like a good idea at the time. So there are a lot of different contributing factors, but the main one is it is a substantial risk reduction for the corporation. And it's not just risk, it's uncertainty at the same time. So you have risk and then uncertain as to when the risk is going to come through. And that combination, anybody in financial management knows what you're trying to do is keep everything steady and smooth and well-disciplined and under control and be able to project and forecast. So it was easy for any financial manager to say, look, everybody else is doing it, I think we should do it too. But there are a lot of different factors that would have contributed. And there was virtually nothing that was going the other way.
If I could touch on that for
Yeah.
a second, I mean, I guess 2 points. One is the financing end, the other's on the sort of the adequacy end of how well this serves people. I mean, I think on the statistic that comes to mind, which I think I got from Olivia Mitchell at Wharton, is that about 1 in 10 people who sign up for a defined benefit plan ended up actually getting a benefit from it. So when I think of DB versus DC, often what I think about is, well, the important thing to me is that DB is universal participation, DC you have to choose, and so half the people don't, choose to do it. But if you have, with a DB plan, if you have a lot of people aren't vesting in their benefit, the benefit formulas are so backloaded that even somebody, and I look at this in the public sector now, if you're, say, a school teacher with a DB plan and you work 15, even close to 20 years, you don't get very much of a pension benefit at all. So when you get a situation where, I think the average person today switches jobs every 4.8 years, and even today I think vesting for DB plans is probably 5 years. In the past it was longer than that. I'm just not sure that's, with this golden age idea, and if you were that person who worked your entire career, my dad worked for one company his whole career, that's great for him, but if you're switching around, I don't think it works. With the financing end is, the reforms that effectively required the plan sponsor to pay for their benefits coincided with them deciding not to do the benefits anymore. And so I think what they realized is that this stuff is expensive to provide. If you want to provide somebody with a fixed, guaranteed benefit at retirement, the way you figure that out is you say, okay, what is the benefit stream? Discount it back at the Treasury rate. That's your cost. And that's what the state and local plans should be doing right now. And if they did it, the cost would be so astronomical. They wouldn't even know how to process it. But it's just that sort of thing costs a ton to do. I think a DC plan, it's not like it's cheaper for somebody to do it at a DC plan, but they have the additional variable of changing when they retire. If your DC plan is doing really well, retire a couple years early. If it's doing really poorly, extend your retirement a few years. That has a very powerful effect, and that's an effect on managing the sort of the returns or smoothing things out that really isn't available in a DB plan because the person chooses to retire when they want to, not based on the financial concerns of the sponsor. So I just tend to think that's, Charlie's right. We're in a DC world now. I just tend to think so we can't go back even if we wanted to, but I tend to think there's nostalgia for this golden age that existed for some people. But I think 401k participation is more widespread today than DB participation ever was. So it's, nothing is perfect, but I think we've got an avenue forward to get something that's pretty good.
One thing you have to do is be careful of numbers and averages and stuff like that, as we all know all the time. But it used to be that a fairly large number of people worked for a fairly long number of years for the company. Loyalty up, loyalty down. People really cared at companies in a different way when people are working there for 20, 25, 30, 35 years. A lot of the 1 in 10 is people getting their first job and then moving on to something they like a lot better. There is a lot of turnover among young people, very young people. What we've experienced as a society is a substantial increase in the number of people of all ages who have turnover in their employment. And so if you look at that 4.8 is a stunning statement, and it's real. And the attitude towards employees, towards companies, loyalty up, that's kind of gone. It's what have I been offered lately? And loyalty down, why should I care? After all, they are different. And So we're getting cultural differences and attitudinal differences blended in with financial differences. It's complicated out there.
Neither of you have used the word, but you both made the point that what you want is portability in retirement savings, among other things, especially with the world we have now. Okay, I'm going to take a question here, and then we'll come to you over here.
Hi, my name's Owen Ranger. I'm at First Financial Group. I'm in the financial industry. You guys have both talked about how you seem to like 401ks in general. Do you feel that there are any major downsides to them on the back end when people are going into retirement and taking distributions? If so, what are they? I mean, I've heard and read that there are up to, for the target plans, for example, there are up to 65 variables in picking a target number, and how knowing any more than 2 of those is impossible unless those don't necessarily work. What do you guys believe are the downsides, if any, in those kinds of plans?
First, Owen Ranger, you've got the best name in the room. I think that's just wonderful. Second, you put your finger right on what is going to be a dreadfully serious problem, not for everybody, because some people will be very, very sensible and they will get information from people who are very careful to give them serious, sobering advice, and they'll be fine. And those who decide to go with required minimum distribution will probably be fine. Those who think to do 4% with inflation adjustment, give me a break. How many people know how to do the inflation adjustment on a 4% on a regular basis and be able to stay there for just a minute? It just won't be all that good a deal. So I'm all for the required minimum distribution as the guideline to follow. And anybody wants to stay below that, great. Anybody wants to go above that, ooh, be careful, because I think it's a communications problem. Then I'm back to my friend Wendy Crawford. She's a lovely, lovely woman. But she and her husband do not have a large saving, and 10% is a huge chunk to take out year after year after year. And she doesn't realize it accelerates down because you're not going to get 10% returns, and the money is going to drain away, and when it gets down, all of a sudden what looked like no more than last year isn't 10%, it's 15 or 20, and you're on your way down and out. And we've got to protect people from that sort of thing, at least to the extent that investor education would be helpful. And at a time when people are really starting to worry about something, and if you're in retirement, you are worried about how much is enough and stuff like that, that's a great time to help people understand more clearly, more exactly what they ought to be thinking about.
And as you say, Charlie, it's not only down, it's a downward acceleration.
Oh boy, yes.
Let me just hit quickly on this. I mean, I just think that there's downsides on either end of it. I mean, I think the example Charlie gave obviously is people are overspending. I mean, at least Humanel did a paper probably maybe close to 10 years ago, showing a lot of people underspend. They're not taking enough out of their accounts. The question is, how do you get something people can live with? And people, for whatever reason, don't like annuities. And an economist will tell you should take all your wealth and annuitize it, and they are the only people who want to do that. You know, the other 99.9% of the population don't. And I mean, part of it is people are already. I mean, like one idea, say, would be if you, to the degree you annuitize your 401k, make it exempt from taxation. And that would encourage people to annuitize. It's also, though, going to be kind of a middle and upper income benefit, though. Your lower income folks, they're already nearly 100% annuitized because they're getting their money from Social Security. So it's one of those things where if you had a choice between annuitizing all your wealth and not, you would annuitize. But what are the marginal gains from annuitizing your 401k when you already have the annuity coming from Social Security? I assume they're a lot smaller. So I just don't know. I don't think there's an easy solution on it. One idea is the idea of a annuity that kicks in towards the end of life that makes sure you're at some adequate level of income. That's something, because it's relatively cheap, it may not be the technically optimal solution, but I think it's something people could live with. If you're 65, you say this is going to kick in at 85, it's going to be cheap because a lot of people die in between. That might be something. Simplicity matters, and you want people to know what it is they're getting. Even then, they may not like it.
I think this is a really strong point, Andrew, and it comes back to my point about Bismarck's 70. being an insurance policy against living too long.
Yeah, that's an insurance problem. The
financially.
65 is
And
savings
85,
problem.
and that's probably 85 now. So we've been mostly talking about savings, but we also have the insurance problem of what happens past, say, 85. And there, I think the deferred annuities, and Andrew, you mentioned before, this ability to buy annuities, and I would say long deferred or longevity annuities in 401ks is a very important idea, because when you're younger, you can buy that insurance cheap.
Yeah, I mean, but granted, if you were to live off your 401k for the first several years of retirement and delay Social Security, then you're buying an additional annuity at a very advantageous price. You're losing liquidity, which people like to have, but that's, if what you want is a higher annuity payment, I mean, sorry to anybody from the insurance industry out here, but the easier way to do it may be just to delay claiming Social Security. Ideally, you delay by working longer, but if you had to use the 401k up front, that might be a way of doing it.
That's
Okay, we
very
have-
good advice. The other advice is be sure you know when you're going to die so that you make a rational decision.
You know, I think it's Henry IV of France, and the astrologers kept predicting that he was going to die, and he said, one day they'll be right. Yes.
Thank you. John Scott from the Pew Charitable Trust. And pardon the advertisement from Pew, but some of my colleagues have recently released some reports on household balance sheets, household finances. And in a nutshell, they're showing that there's a significant number of Americans who experience not just financial shocks, but wide swings in their income, both positive and negative. And many Americans are not prepared for even a 3-month hiatus in their income, that they really wouldn't not have enough to live on beyond a month. We're also about to release a report on household debt, which I think will kind of show the other side of the ledger, which Americans are accumulating a ton of debt at the household level. It raises sort of the age-old question, and I'd appreciate your fresh, views on this, but your assumption seems to be in the conversation that Americans are able to save for retirement, but just simply aren't. And so is that really a good assumption to make for a lot of Americans? But I think also it raises, in my mind, what's the right balance between short-term and long-term savings? We need to have Americans build up a cushion for those inevitable financial shocks or goals like buying a new house if you're a millennial, things of that nature. But at the same time, we obviously have to be thinking about living beyond age 70. So appreciate your thoughts.
It's a great question. It's going to be our last question since we're almost out of time, but it's a good one to end
I'm
on.
going to sound a little judgmental here, but it's, there's, people say, well, I can't save for retirement. Again, you can look at, what people have in their homes today. How big are their homes? Do they have computers and big screen TVs and all that sort of stuff versus what people in the past had who had much less and yet saved at higher rates. I think there is sort of a present-mindedness. Shows I'm getting old, because I'm sure every person says, all these kids these days.
It's all right, you got a long way to go.
I find it a little bit implausible if somebody's got a 40 or 50-inch TV these days is the standard, I guess, and say, okay, I can't save for retirement, and yet you're paying $125 a month on your cell phone, on your satellite TV. Part of it is people getting their priorities in the right place, and so I don't know. I mean, I think defaulting people into saving would catch a lot of the folks who probably aren't thinking about it very much, get them saving, and then they can adjust out of that. I mean, my own personal approach is save what I need to save, and then after that, just spend it on whatever I want. Don't tell my wife that, but do the things you need to do up front. But I think people can save. I think most people can.
Charlie, as the honored guest of AEI, we're going to give you the last word here.
First of all, thank you very much for your time and attention, and I think we've been very blessed by two terrific guys, moderator, and you are an expert, thank goodness, that's really important. And if you don't mind, I'd also like to celebrate Pew Charitable Trust and what Rebecca Reimel has done to give guidance to an extraordinary professional staff, and what you guys have done in the way of informing the dialogue has been just terrific. I'm inclined to stop right there and just say thank you very, very much.
Thank you all for coming, and let's show our appreciation for our great speakers.
Thank you very much. So good. I just love it.
Thank you.